On July 1, 2022 in London, app designer George goes to the bank to ask for a loan. His app is called Hazard Lights and is supposed to predict big events by analyzing global data. He's granted the loan, and after celebrating with his girlfriend Sarah, he receives bigger news: she's pregnant. Soon the couple gets married, ready to start their own family. 3 months later, a deadly virus called MERS-22 is spreading through the world and people are uncertain about their futures. Hospitals are beyond capacity and the number of deaths rises every day. On Christmas morning, both George and Sarah are coughing, so they go to the hospital. The place is incredibly crowded, and the couple worries about the baby. The next morning, George wakes up and notices it's July 1st on the calendar. Sarah reminds him to go to the bank, and when he gets there, the employee has no register of him or the loan. George feels strange and doesn't react well, so he doesn't get the money. Later at home, George tells Sarah the day is repeating, but she just thinks he's talking nonsense. The next morning, George asks Sarah to take a pregnancy test, but she refuses and says he's being weird. In the evening, George checks some websites and sees MERS-22 is already out. He tells Sarah that a pandemic is coming, but she thinks he's going mad and asks him to get help. The following day, Sarah comes home to discover George has gone full-on survivalist, having bought a hazmat suit and tons of supplies. Tired of his attitude, Sarah decides to leave and stay with her parents. George tries to follow her out only to be approached by Archie, who starts talking about time jumps and loops. She says she has answers for his questions and gives him a business card in case it happens again before leaving. George goes to the address in the morning, but he only sees an abandoned building and doesn't go inside. The next morning, George wakes up on July 1st again. This time he doesn't tell Sarah anything and rushes to the address from the card. Inside the building he finds Archie, who tells him he's a mutant. Time jumps have been happening for a while, but only a very tiny part of the population can sense them. Most of the time the skill is given by a special serum, but rarely some people develop it organically. George has actually experienced 20 time jumps, but he's only remembered the last 2. This whole incident is known as the Lazarus-Project, a top-secret multinational organization dedicated to preventing or undoing mass extinction events. The world has ended in numerous different timelines due to wars and pandemics, but each time they've stopped all of these through time travel after exhausting all other methods. Afterward, Archie takes George to a different building where the organization works on all the technology behind the serum and the machine. Archie explains they can only jump through specific points in time called singularities, which always happen on July 1st. She asks George to join them, and he agrees when he hears they developed the vaccine that stopped COVID. When he goes home, he tells Sarah that he got the loan. The next day Archie introduces him to other organization members, including the leader Wes. The other agents were trained in the military or police, so George feels a little awkward. Thankfully everyone is very friendly and soon George is put on gun training. Most of the work he does is research, but he's happy because he's helping save the world. He also still has time to spend with Sarah and the couple continues to do well. One afternoon, George uses his app software to track some shady business activity and discovers some unusual movements in a Russian account. This is linked to the security company that had been guarding Big Boy, a nuclear warhead. The buyer seems to be Dennis, one of the most dangerous men in the world. He used to be one of Lazarus' best agents before he went rogue. Sometime later, George drops Sarah at the school she works at. At that moment she almost gets hit by a truck, but thankfully George pulls her away just in time. Afterward the team travels to Paris to find Dennis. George stays in the van with Dane and watches on the cameras how special agents burst into a building, but soon they have interference. The agents appear to open fire in the corridors, and when Archie goes to the basement to investigate, she's immediately shot down by Dennis. Worried, George runs out of the van to save her, only to see Dennis come through a window on a bike. George jumps back into the van and a chase ensues, which causes them to hit many civilian cars on the way and soon the cops follow them too. After the police cars also crash, George finally opens fire but misses all the shots. Eventually they corner Dennis into crashing, only for Dane to be shot down as soon as he steps out. George and Dennis then have a gunfight, but when the cops suddenly surround them, Dennis decides to detonate a bomb, destroying the whole city. The loop kicks in and George appears on July 1st in the middle of his naughty time with Sarah, causing him to cling to her in fear. The next day, George drops Sarah at school again. He then gets a text saying he's needed at work early, so he leaves quickly. As he walks away, the truck passes by and hits Sarah because this time George isn't there to prevent it. A flashback then shows that in summer 2018, Archie was in Russia with her partner Ross. They sat on a roof and watched missiles fire above them, triggering the end of the world before the loop kicked in. In the present, George is waiting in the hospital while Sarah goes through surgery. Archie visits him and informs him they've caught Dennis. Soon a doctor informs George that Sarah is still unconscious and they don't know if she'll ever wake up. When George finally sees her, he starts having lots of weird visions from the previous timelines. Another flashback from summer 2018 shows that George attended a party and his friend asked him to meet a girl named Sarah. Afterward George goes home to drink with Archie, who explains they changed the timeline a lot in 2018. A new flashback shows Ross and Archie trying to warn the Russian military about the incoming missiles, but they weren't believed and the duo had to watch the end of the world again before the reset. In the present, George decides to go to work, ignoring Archie's warnings about the shock and trauma he's obviously going through. She also warns him that he can't prevent Sarah's accident, pointing out how selfish it would be. Another flashback shows that Archie and Ross broke up with their significant others to be together. Since the Russian government wasn't listening to them, they had no choice but to shoot a missile at the Prime Minister's chief while he was in his car. Unfortunately, this didn't work and the missiles were shot again. At the same time in the party, George finally met Sarah, but everyone suddenly had to run out when a cigarette started a fire and he lost track of her. In the present, George is approached by Shiv, the other natural mutant in the team. Shiv thinks they should get revenge on the guy that caused Sarah's accident. At first George agrees, but when they arrive at the guy's house, George realizes that beating up the man won't bring back Sarah and refuses to do it. In 2018, Ross and Archie broke into a government building and got stuck in a gunfight, causing Archie to die. This triggered the loop, and Archie had to break up with her boyfriend again. Then she met with Ross and they concluded the only way to stop World War III was to put a fascist in charge of Russia. They started a coup through the nation and their candidate quickly gained power, but during a speech he got shot and soon the missiles fell again. At the party, George missed Sarah again. Archie and Sarah kept on trying many different plans, but they all failed and the missiles always fell in the end. They also had to keep breaking up with their significant others. At the same time, George kept on missing Sarah at the party. Eventually Ross confessed to Archie that the one time their plan worked was when she got shot, yet he still triggered the loop to bring her back. Archie called him out for being selfish, so this time he replayed the plan alone by bringing an explosive to a restaurant with the right politicians. Archie had to watch how he was shot before the explosion, which finally stopped the war. Then she begged Wes to reset time to save Ross, but Wes refused. At that same time in the USA, George and Sarah got to meet and properly start a relationship. In the present, Shiv and George go to see Dennis in the organization's basement. Dennis claims he doesn't know where the warhead is because the time reset has caused Lazarus to capture him before he received it. Then Dennis starts telling George that Lazarus tortures people to get them to confess and how the organization sacrifices lives to stop death. He thinks the world has wanted to end for a while and that Lazarus is essentially cheating, so his mission is just letting the inevitable happen. Moments later, George gets a call telling him Sarah has died. He rushes to the hospital and has a breakdown when he sees her. Finally snapping, George decides to visit Dennis again and agrees to follow what he has to say. In 2017, Lazarus agent Janet took a test and discovered she was pregnant. The father was Dennis, who was still working for the organization then. 2 weeks before the July 1st, Janet gave birth to a healthy baby boy. Unfortunately, a few hours before the checkpoint, China threatened to launch an attack with chemical weapons. Janet rushed to the office to beg Wes to try harder, but Wes informed her they tried everything and they had no choice. As Janet had a breakdown, the loop was triggered and Janet woke up in bed with a pregnant belly. Eventually Janet gave birth again, but this time the child was a girl. A year passed without issues, but unfortunately summer 2018 came and repeatedly triggered all those loops. Janet and Dennis kept losing their child, giving birth, and living the first year of their baby over and over again. When the mission in Russia was finally over, Dennis confronted Wes, who didn't act sorry at all. Dennis snapped and promised to stop the Lazarus Project from playing God before shooting Wes' assistant. Before he could shoot Wes too, Shiv appeared behind him and took his gun, so then Dennis knocked him down and escaped. In the present, Dennis doesn't share any intel, so Lazarus is still looking for Big Boy. They discover that a rebel group called the Lost Glory could be key to this, so they must travel to Prague to track them down. George wants to go, but Archie says he isn't in the right state of mind for field work. While everyone's gone, George goes to see Dennis, who gives him a YouTube channel name and an address in Barcelona to get in contact with the Lost Glory and warn them that Lazarus is coming. Later in Barcelona, George finds the address and the door is already opened. Suddenly he's held at gunpoint by Dennis' contact, who turns out to be Janet. She lets him go after George uses Dennis' code words and learns what happened while revealing a child is with her. George asks her to help set up a detonator for him so he can take out Big Boy, and Janet agrees. In Prague, the team enters a house in a forest and finds everyone gone, but there are some drawings on a wall. Back to George, he spends the night in Janet's place and hears the whole story about the baby. The next morning, he wakes up to find Janet gone, but there's a tin with the detonator and a note that says, "I hope you get her back." A new flashback shows that in 1981, Shiv was already experiencing strange things as a child. In just one day, he learned to crawl out of his crib, could walk, and talk in full sentences. As years passed, he started to have visions of the future in his dreams. His mother told him none of it was real, but Shiv could tell it was. Years later, he had analyzed the situation enough to test it. He memorized the winner of horse races, and when the loop triggered, he bet on the right names and made lots of money. Now he could buy the video game console he wanted and tons of new clothes. One night, Shiv went to visit his uncle only to discover the uncle died when the shop burned down. Thankfully that night an end of the world happened and a loop was triggered, so the shop came back to normal and his uncle lived. In the evening, Shiv rushed to prevent the fire only to discover his cousin had been the one to start it to get the insurance money. Shiv managed to stop him, but he had already called the police and his cousin got arrested. When Shiv returned home, Wes was there to recruit him. In the present, Shiv interrogates Dennis about the plans they found in Prague, but Dennis won't talk. In private, George calls Shiv out for using violent means as part of the interrogation. Shiv explains that bad information caused the mission problems which resulted in the loop that gave Dennis and Janet all the baby troubles, so he refuses to let that happen ever again. A flashback reveals that when Dennis escaped, Shiv chased after him and their cars crashed. Both men took out their weapons and after an argument, Shiv shot Dennis in the leg and captured him. Dennis was dropped at the hospital, but moments later he managed to escape by killing a guard. Shiv then looked for Janet, but she was gone as well. In the present, George has messages from the family about organizing Sarah's funeral, but he ignores them to work on decoding the drawings from Prague instead. After putting tons of information on a software, he discovers the big boy is in Romania. He immediately buys an airplane ticket using Sarah's credit card. In the morning, George calls the office and tells Shiv he won't go to work because he's sick. Shiv is suspicious and tells the team's hacker Ryan to check both George's and Sarah's bank accounts in secret. When the truth comes out, Shiv goes after George alone and tells Archie the sickness lie. Moments later, Shiv tracks George's movements thanks to Ryan sending him updates every time George buys something. George gets on a train and Shiv uses a cab to catch up to him, managing to board the train just in time, thanks to a delay in the schedule. Shiv searches the train until he finds George and a fight ensues, but George quickly knocks him out and takes Shiv's gun. Then George pulls the emergency brake, smashes the window, and runs through the fields to escape. Shiv soon wakes up and starts chasing after him. They end up running through a town nearby and George enters a building to try to sneak out through the window, only to fall instead. Then he steals a bike, so Shiv beats up two guys to steal a car and keep on following him. Outside town, George finds the road blocked and falls again, getting out of the way right before Shiv crashes against the bike. Shiv tries to convince George that the grief is making him act wildly and that he won't be able to kill thousands of people to save one, but George just responds by shooting him twice. Afterward George grabs Shiv's phone and pretends to be him as he texts Ryan, telling him to go see Dennis and use a certain code word. Ryan does so and Dennis immediately snaps his neck through the bars. Back to George, he hands Shiv's body in the stolen car and returns to his search for Big Boy. Another flashback shows that in 2014, Archie was working as an undercover agent for the UK's Secret Service. After spending an afternoon riding with criminals and being chased by the police, Archie went home to find Shiv, who said this wasn't the first time they had this conversation. He warned her that if she made the arrest it'd cause a huge war and the end of the world. At first Archie didn't take him seriously, but Shiv shared enough classified information to convince her to give Lazarus a chance. In the present, the alarms go off over Ryan's death and Archie desperately looks for a new IT guy that could access his computer. She also calls George, who just ignores her. Wes interrogates Dennis, who explains Ryan gave him a death code and that there's a mole in the organization who shared that code and also prevented the Prague raid. Back to George, he's stopped by police because the car has been reported as stolen. George answers the questions pretty badly and keeps getting distracted by important information on his phone sent by Janet. Desperate, he gets the car going as fast as he can, so the police start chasing him. He's getting crazier by the second, not caring if he hits someone on the way. As he drives, George calls Archie and tells her he's come to Romania because he's got a lead, claiming Shiv's part of Janet's rebel group. He proves it by saying Janet has been receiving money from Shiv, which is true but that's because Shiv felt guilty about the baby incident and tried to help her. Archie goes to ask Dennis about it, who lies too and confirms the mole is Shiv. Archie is having trouble believing this and keeps remembering all the times Shiv was honest with her, not hiding all the nasty things Lazarus had to do to save the world. He also warned her that all the time jumping would sometimes make her have visions from the other timelines, including seeing her own death. Eventually Archie got to see all the times Shiv had contacted her and she failed to follow his warnings. However, it's hard to keep up the denial when Archie gets his bank movements and confirms George's story. She sends Shiv a text message, but there's no answer. In Romania, George keeps on running away and manages to hide the car in a small alley, thinking it's finally over. However, when he comes out, a cop crashes his car from behind and the trunk opens, revealing the body. When the cop approaches George, he stops by the window only to suddenly get hit by a truck. Then the driver comes out and George shoots him before throwing a tantrum as he realizes how low he's falling. Still using the same car, George escapes and finally arrives at the spot from the drawings. He enters the building with his gun out, only to suddenly be jumped on by the caretaker. A fight ensues and after lots of struggle, the men get stuck in a standoff, only for the caretaker to accidentally fall down the stairs. When he finally wakes up, George gives him his gun to convince him they're on the same team and the caretaker agrees to show him the bomb. They drive to a building in the middle of nowhere and George finally sees the bomb on the back of a truck. Since that area is just open fields, they agree to move it to a more densely populated area to cause a bigger effect when it blows up. As they drive off with the warhead, George doesn't notice a car is following them and even hearing their conversation through a bug in the truck. A flashback reveals that 24 hours ago, a group of mercenaries took out the real caretaker and one of the men took his place to wait for the detonator to arrive. However, in the present, George explains to the fake caretaker that only he can use the detonator. The group has no choice but to go along for now. Moments later, the truck breaks down in the middle of the road. George finally sees the car in the mirror and immediately punches the fake caretaker before slamming his head repeatedly into the steering wheel. Then he comes out and opens fire on the other mercenaries, but only kills one before a gunfight begins. The caretaker wakes up and shoots him, so George hides under the truck while a civilian car appears on the road. The mercenaries kill the new arrivals, but now they're distracted and George manages to quickly finish them off. Then George tries the truck again to no avail. Refusing to give up, he sets up the detonator and drives away in a car. As he drives, he calls Archie to tell her Shiv got the bomb and he couldn't stop him. Once he's far enough, he detonates the warhead. The huge explosion soon appears on the Lazarus systems. Afterward, George goes to the airport but can't catch a flight. Thankfully, there's a group of rich kids who think he's cool and are also going to London on their private plane, so they bring him along. During the flight, George can see the damage caused by the bomb. Suddenly he wakes up and is at home with Sarah, but the building starts shaking and another explosion brings it all down. Then George wakes up again and realizes it was a dream. When George returns to the office, he claims that when he cracked the code he called the office to warn Wes, but Shiv answered and manipulated him with lies. He even gives Wes Shiv's phone to prove his story. Next, George asks Archie about the consequences of the bomb, but the explosion only killed around a couple hundred people. It's not enough to start a war, so a time reset won't be happening. George is devastated because it means he's killed people for nothing, not to mention a new checkpoint is approaching and he won't be able to revive Sarah after they reach it. Meanwhile, Wes checks Shiv's phone and finds the messages George sent pretending to be him, which further proves his story. To be sure, she confirms with Dennis that the code word is the same. Then she takes George with her to visit the Russian ambassador to make sure the bomb was a rebel going wild and not a political attack. Refusing to give up, George later calls the ambassador and informs her that the British are involved in the attack, telling her where to find the farmhouse with the car and Shiv's body. A few hours later, George visits the ambassador, who confirms they've found the body. However, the ambassador doesn't want to start a war based on so little and asks him to go to Russia to present better intel. Getting desperate, George shoots the ambassador, all the agents, and her husband, but leaves the son alive to force him to press the panic button. Moments later, an alarm goes off at Lazarus because Russia is sending missiles. Wes has no choice but to reset time, even if it means losing Dennis. After a series of visions, George wakes up in bed with Sarah, clinging to her in joy. Dennis is free and rushes to hide, while Shiv is also back and remembers everything. Archie tries to call Shiv to demand an explanation, but he's eager for revenge and ignores her. Soon Shiv makes it to George's building, but George is already waiting for him with a gun on the stairs. George explains the things he did to make Shiv look guilty, so Shiv decides to leave without shooting George because it would only make him look worse. The next day, George drops Sarah at work and stops her from getting in the accident. When he arrives at the office, Archie tells him that Ryan's story confirms George's and nobody has heard from Shiv. There are agents searching for him, but he's good at covering his tracks. Through the rest of the day, George continues to have visions from the other timelines. Meanwhile in Paris, Lazarus tries to repeat the operation to capture Dennis. However, he's waiting for them and in just a few minutes he kills every single agent. Weeks pass and George lives a great life with Sarah while ignoring the constant visions he gets. 3 months later, Sarah and George go on a trip to Paris and George finally proposes. Sarah accepts, but the next morning, she admits she made a mistake. She explains she doesn't want to marry George because she feels they've changed too much and lately she hasn't been very happy. Then she announces she'll pay for her part of the trip and leaves. Sometime later, Archie informs George that Shiv's credit card was used in a bar in Germany. George checks the footage from the security cameras near the bar and discovers a bunch of dead bodies together with a necklace belonging to Janet's group. Wes immediately sends Archie and George out to investigate. At the crime scene, they find Janet's DNA and evidence of a hostage, so they think the gunfight was a rescue attempt. Later, another camera confirms the presence of Agent Zhang, which indicates involvement from the Chinese government. Days pass and it's now June 30th, meaning a new checkpoint will be created at midnight. At 11:57 p.m., George hears someone entering his apartment. He grabs his gun and leaves the room only to be jumped on by Shiv, triggering a fight. After lots of struggle, George shoots Shiv right as the clock hits 12 a.m. This means that even if time resets, Shiv will be dead at his apartment. A desperate George rushes to the body and finds a piece of paper covered in blood. His neighbor Reggie knocks on the door because he heard the noise and George pretends he was watching a movie, although the blood on his t-shirt is still visible. Afterward, George drags the body out on the elevator, so he's caught on camera. He drives for a few hours and eventually stops at the local harbor, where he makes the car explode with the body inside. Next he walks all the way to his apartment and sees the blood on the floor. However, he has a meeting with Sarah and decides to clean later. At the cafe, Sarah drops some big news. She's met someone and they're getting married soon. A devastated George bursts out and returns home to clean off the blood. He also burns the piece of paper. 3 weeks later, George keeps on calling Archie but she won't answer. When George goes home after work, a detective approaches him because Reggie reported George's suspicious behavior. The detective has the camera footage from the elevator and wants to arrest George, but at that moment a bright light goes off in the sky and a loop kicks in, resetting time until George is back in the apartment with Shiv's body. George is very confused because loops usually don't happen like that. Then a flashback shows what happened in Germany 3 weeks ago. Janet had been Zhang's hostage, but her group was soon caught red-handed and a gunfight ensued. Zhang escaped with Janet right before they could be found by the shooter, who turned out to be Shiv. On the floor, he found a note dropped by Janet that said one of Dennis' passwords. That was the paper George found and burned later. In the present, the reset means Reggie comes over again, but this time George remembers to change his shirt and speaks more casually about the movie, so Reggie believes him. Then he gets a call from Wes telling him to come to the office. When he arrives, the alarm is going off and he learns the light he saw was an explosion caused by 2 black holes colliding. Lazarus can't control such a humongous natural event, so they'll have to repeat the same 3 weeks constantly until they can come up with a solution. The 2 black holes appearing together formed a singularity, and George points out those just don't happen overnight, so someone must be behind it. Wes thinks the only person smart enough to do so is Janet, and if Zhang has her then China is involved in some way. Afterward George goes through the same awful meeting with Sarah and goes to the supermarket for supplies. This time he disposes of Shiv's body by wrapping it properly and covering the security with paint. Then he throws the body into the river. Meanwhile Archie is in Shanghai, where she threatens Zhang's sister until she gets Zhang's hideout address. Archie immediately goes to the place, but as soon as she opens the door, a bunch of agents shoot her down and time resets. This time, George doesn't go to see Sarah, so she goes to see him instead. This causes her to find him putting the body in the car, and she can tell what it is because of the blood. Terrified, Sarah runs away, so George drives after her and convinces her to get in the car. He finally tells her about his real job and even takes her to the office. At first she's upset by the fact he killed people, but soon she understands he's helping the world and that night they end up doing the naughty again. The next morning, she agrees to keep everything a secret. Then George gets rid of the body again. In Shanghai, Archie approaches the sister again and threatens to kill her family if she doesn't tell the truth. This time Archie gets the real address and sneaks into Zhang's bedroom, where Zhang immediately defends herself. A fight ensues and both women show great fighting skills, however Archie manages to handcuff their hands. Seeing no other choice, Zhang self-deletes. Time resets again right as George is finishing a wonderful date with Sarah. The next time Archie goes to Zhang's place, she's waiting with her gun out. It turns out Zhang remembers the loops because China has been developing their own loop system this whole time. Zhang explains she handed Janet to her handler but doesn't know where they are. She also reveals that her organization has been tracking the LazarusProject this whole time and George led them to Janet, leaving Archie in shock. In London, Sarah finds George with the body in the car again. George drives after her once more, but this time he's too nervous and accidentally runs over her. He doesn't look too worried though, he just puts the body in the car and waits for another loop to start. From then on, George starts going to the meeting with Sarah and every time the loop restarts he has to hear her say she's getting married again. He also has to get rid of Shiv's body over and over. Eventually Lazarus gets tired of reliving the same 3 weeks and Wes decides they should get the government involved. She also begins considering getting a serum shot for herself. After this meeting, George goes home and finds Archie waiting for him. She knows what he did and tells him to help Shiv during the next loop or there'll be consequences. When time resets, George takes pictures of Shiv's wounds and by pretending to be a cop he speaks to a doctor, hoping for a way to help Shiv's collapsed lung. However, the doctor says there's nothing he could have done. He goes home in a bad mood and finds Sarah waiting for him, but he just admits he knows about her engagement and asks her to leave him alone. During the next loop, George snaps at Reggie when he knocks, pushing him out as he yells. The next morning, Reggie approaches George to apologize and George sees his working clothes, discovering Reggie is a paramedic. Next George takes the piece of paper to a curator, who uses a special liquid to clean off the blood. The paper now shows Dennis' code word and some words in Chinese that translate to time machine. Afterward George steals some serum and goes to see Sarah. He explains everything that happened and gives her the option to take the serum so she can have the visions of the other lives together. Sarah is unsure, so George lets have the injection and leaves. When he returns home, Dennis is there asking for Janet. George has to explain Archie is looking for her and that they're stuck in a singularity. Dennis finds the note Shiv dropped but when he's about to explain the meaning, time resets. This time George rushes to get Reggie so Shiv can live. In Shanghai, Archie meets with Zhang and shares her theory. China tried making its own serum and made a mistake along the way, causing the singularity. Since Janet is a genius, they must have kidnapped her to make her fix the issue. Then Jong reveals she's found where Janet is located. Moments later, Archie and Jong sneak into the old building where the government is keeping Janet. They silently make their way through the stairs, killing every guard they see without much trouble. However, when they finally open the room Janet is supposed to be in, they find it empty. In London, Reggie manages to bring Shiv back long enough for him to say that Dennis is the key. At the same time, Dennis goes to Lazarus, knocking out a guard in the elevator before revealing himself. Since he remembers the note from the last loop, he explains that the code word Janet used means "I'm in trouble, come and get me." They won't find Janet because she isn't in their timeline anymore. Someone has found a way to break through the checkpoint. Archie and Jong are in the right location, but not the right time. Janet's actually in London in 2012. That year, while he was hanging out with his Janet, Dennis received a text message that he hadn't understood, but now he knows it came from this other Janet. He knows where she is, so Lazarus will have to take him back to solve this whole issue. Back in George's apartment, Shiv seems to be doing well. At that moment Sarah walks in, revealing she remembers everything because she took the serum. Make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you can watch more videos like this. Thanks for watching.